NestJS. What is NestJS? Well, NestJS, it's your answer if you're looking for something easy to use, fast to work with, reliable and scalable, that works on top of Express.js. It supports fully progressive apps with JavaScript and TypeScript. It uses elements of object-oriented programming as well as functional programming and functional reactive programming. Now, you can use Express.js, which is what I'm going to show you in this example from today. However, you can also configure it to use Fastify as well. Now, let's get started. Let's get started with the installation. And we're going to create a simple project, which I'm going to show you now with a little bit of which is what we're going to achieve by the end of this video. So I'm going to bring up so that's my code editor. This is our the NestJS project that we're going to explore together during this in this hour. So essentially in here I created a project where I have a list of users. I have a user model in which each user has an ID, has a name, an age, a surname and an email. I used in here the public constructor, so it tells me is the equivalent of saying having for example an ID outside of the user class that they can access internally as this.id inside different methods. I have a controller, which is what allows me to generate to handle the requests coming from a certain URL, in this case from users, and I'm handling post requests, get requests, put requests, and delete requests. Now, all of this is controlled through the module, and the module is something central within a NestJS app. And finally, I have my user service users.service.ts, which instead it's where you do the insertion, the getting of the users, updates, and deletion, and finding of the users. Now, if you want to see how all of this comes together, keep watching this video. I'm going to start with the installation of the project and then go on and show all of this to you. And we click on the documentation. We are going to see how to install the CLI. What the CLI is actually going to do is going to install a set of tools that we can use, and we can use it to also start a new project. If you don't want to start up a new project through the CLI, you have an alternative, which is listed in the documentation here, in which you can clone the project from the TypeScript starter of the NestJS project, and you can simply run those commands to run it. So I'm going to use the CLI. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy paste this command, which I've actually already done, so this should be actually quite fast. And then I'm going to actually start up a new project. So NestJS YouTube example in my case. Because I actually have multiple package managers installed in my system, NestJS CLI is detecting that and is asking me which package manager I want to use, npm or yarn. In my case, I'm going to stick with npm. And now my installation happens. It's going to take a few minutes, depending on the speed of your internet connection. So see you once this is completed for us. And a set of files are being created in this folder. So first of all, we have a tsconfig.json with some default options coming directly through the NestJS. If you don't know what each one of those means, you might have a look at my TypeScript for beginners tutorial, because I cover most of those. In the tsconfig build, there is the tsconfig for the build environment, in which there is some extensions for the exclude, in which the ts excludes the test files, essentially. Then we have our package files, and a CLI configuration file for NestJS, where it specifies what's the source root and which one are the commands that are available. A project that you can run is, for example, you can structure in which way to run the commands, which commands are available, etc. In the printer file, you have the settings that you of course can change depending on your organization. ESLint, which it's not just for JavaScript but also for TypeScript, and as you know from my TypeScript for beginners, it's the preferred module, the preferred linter system for TypeScript as well as for plain JavaScript. And there are some rules a little bit different from standard that are in this file. Now in the source directory we have our main, which is the entry point of the program. As you can see, this function really looks a lot like an express function. In fact, this is all built on top of Express, and as you can see, the app.listen really looks similar, and essentially is the same as the one that you can configure when you have Express. And the app module, it's what wires up everything together. So in here we have a module. In this app module, it's where you tell NestJS how to wire up all the items, and we're gonna see it during our creation of our API, how this one gets bundled together. In the controller method, of course, it's where the requests are handled. Now, this controller annotation at the top here, without any parameters, means that once you hit any URL, any filter of this URL, so for example slash, so the root of our application, this controller is going to get hit. And when you have a get method, this get method is going to return a string coming from a service, and this comes from the concept of having a lean controller and a fat service file. In the service, it's where we actually do the accessing of the database, etc. Now, at this level, you can see that this method is returning a string, and by default, what NestJS is going to try to do is going to match the return type of the headers for this method to be of type text HTML. Now, why this is important? Well, this is important because if in here you're going to return an object, instead NestJS is going to set up the content type header automatically to text to a JSON type of header. You can also, of course, change the headers with a decorator. For changing headers, you can put more than one, of course. However, that's enough talking for now. Let's have a look how to set up a new project in here. And this one, I was forgetting about this. This one, it's a spec file, so it's a test file in which we make sure that the app controller is working as intended. It's fairly easy to use. We have this create testing module in which we specify the controller that we are using, which providers we are using, and then we run the method in the controller, and we ensure that is returning the right value. Now, leaving this one here, however, because I want to keep this introduction really simple, I'm not gonna talk about this method here. So let's get right in. Let's get started with our user module. So let's get started by defining a user model. So we need to define a class named user, and this class is gonna have some parameters such as ID, which is gonna be of type string. It's gonna have a name, age of type string. So actually age should be a type number, and maybe for our user we want an email. Now in the constructor we are going to receive those variables: ID of type string, name of type string, age of type number, and then inside the constructor we're going to define this dot id equal to id, etc. However, there is actually a shorter way to specify all of this, and essentially what we can do inside the constructor is to use the word public. So we're gonna take this block of code and we're going to prepend the public keyword in front of each one of these methods. This is gonna tell TypeScript that essentially this file, this class ID, is actually settable externally. So I can pass through an ID, a name, and it's gonna do all of that boilerplate code for us. So we can just do this. Now the next bit to do once we defined our model is to define a controller class. So we're going to define users.controller.ts, and this one again is going to be a class. So we're going to say export class user controller, and here we're going to use a decorator of type controller coming from NestJS, and in here we can actually specify where this class, which area this class is responsible for hitting. In this case, we want to make it to return for users. Okay, we're gonna have a constructor which is gonna be empty for now, and let's say get users. Now this one is going to have a decorator of type get. Here's where we're going to inject our service. So let's add our service file. The service class is again export class users service. And in here we're going to put all the different methods that this class is going to require. Okay. However, what's important is that we're gonna say that this class is injectable. Again, from NestJS common. And because we're using this service in our controller, now what we want to do in our controller module, we're going to say that our user service is of type user service, and this way we can access the user service from our methods. Now let's keep the thing simple for now. So we are wiring up all of this together. Let's run the command to start it, so which is npm run start dev, which is defined in our package.json, and it's going to start with the watch flag. So what we can do, we can actually go on localhost 3000. As you can see, we get actually a 404 error. The reason for this is that we need to actually specify on NestJS what is actually going on and wire up all of this all together. Alright, so let's go ahead, let's go back to the code and let's fix this. What we need to do is to have a module, and this module class, it's what is going to do the wiring up. We need a module for each one of the modules we are working on, so we're going to create a model for the users and another one for the applications, for application itself. So we need to have a user model, of course. So let's go back to user and create one here. So let's add a new file, which I'm going to call users.module.ts. And this is going to be a class. We're going to use a decorator of type module. And on this decorator, we're going to put an object with 3 parameters: imports, controllers, and providers. Now, the import is only required in the first level, so in the app module TS. In this one, we just need to provide controllers and providers. In our case, we have a user controller and a user service that, as you remember, was the injectable service inside the app. So, which, thank you to that decorator, is going to be available inside the user controller class. And then we just have an empty class for user module. And here I actually forgot to add the app module TS to add this users module in the import. So let's go ahead and fix it. Inside the app module imports, we're going to have the users module. And now if you refresh, we're gonna get the hello flag. Alright, so let's keep going on with our project. Let's do a little bit of cleanup in here, and let's create let's create a post example for our users example. So the first thing we're gonna need is a service class where to save all of these users. So in here, I'm creating a private variable users in which we can actually insert our users. We can substitute this one later, and I'm actually planning or making a new video, which might be available when you're watching it, on using DynamoDB together with NestJS. If you do, please leave a comment below, and I'm gonna make sure that to make it. So we have this insert user, and we're going to receive all of these parameters from our controller. And we're gonna create a user. However, we're not actually getting an ID. So for now, I might stick simple number 1, and then we're going to pass through name, age, surname, and email. And then I'm gonna take the users array and simply push this users array with the newly created user. And then I'm simply gonna return the ID of this newly returned user, which in this case would be simply 1. However, this is not the most elegant solution. So for this reason, basically I can only do one insertion. Well, I could do many, but each one is gonna have the same ID, so it's gonna be pretty confusing. For this reason, I decided to use a package called UUID, which is going to allow me to easily create UUID codes. So once it is installed, let's go ahead and make use of it. Let's make use of it. So first of all, let's go on the top section of the file, and let's import UUID v4 as a v4. From this package we just installed the UUID. And now we can actually generate an ID, so const ID equal to UUID v4, and now replace this one with the ID just generated. Okay, so this one is looking good. We can move on the actual controller. Right now we don't have a method for the post. So for the post method, we're gonna use the post decorator in here. So it's gonna be @post. Now we need to make use of this user service now. So this user service that is defined in the constructor should be defined as private and read-only, which is a helper from TypeScript to make sure we're not going to actually override any of the methods inside the class. So we're going to use this user service inside the class, and we're going to say that this dot user service dot insert user, and then we're going to put all the different items such as name, age, number, etc. Now, if this one was a normal Express.js application, in here you would have a request and a response parameter, and in the request you could access the body and then parse the body to get the name, age, number, etc. In NestJS, you actually have a decorator, which you can use inside the function. And in here, we can actually specify this body decorator coming from the NestJS common for each one of those parameters, and then specify the type of each one of those parameters. So we're gonna have a name, an age, a surname, and an email, each one of type string, except for age, which is of type number. And then what we can do, we can go here inside the insert user and pass those parameters through and ensure that those are gonna be they're gonna be saved correctly. Now what we are returning from the service, we are returning the user ID, so we're gonna to save it and gonna return it to the client. We're gonna do return ID equal to user ID, and that's it. Now to test it, I'm gonna use Postman, because otherwise I would have to make a full UI, so I'm gonna use Postman. So let's access localhost 3000 and let's make sure that this one actually works. So as you can see, we're getting hello world. If we go to users, we get just the word hello from the get method before. Now from the drop down, we're gonna select post, then we click on row. We're gonna put a row body and of type JSON, and in here we're gonna specify our body. In here we're gonna specify a name, Bob, an age of 22, a surname, Smith, and finally an email of bob@email.com. And now if you're gonna click the send button, you're gonna see we're gonna get an ID back. There you go. This is an ID back. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's proceed with the other methods. In a similar way to what we've done so far, now we need to add the other methods. So we're gonna add the get method, get all of the users method, we're gonna have an update user method, and finally a delete user. Each one of these methods is gonna be applied to our array in the user service, and then later on we're gonna see how to use DynamoDB for this. So let's start. The first method we're going to add is the get all users method. All this method has to do is to return all the users coming from the service. So we're gonna have a user service and then get users, and we're going to make this method. Now in here we can of course add some limitations and some pagination. However, we're not gonna add any at this stage yet. So in the get method, it's gonna say that when this controller is hit with the get method from HTTP request, that particular function is going to be run automatically by NestJS. So let's write our get user function. It's going to simply return the users array. So just this.users. In here, I'm adding it into an array that I'm spreading to actually return a copy of that array, because if I don't, then I'm actually referencing the pointers to that array, and that's actually a security concern, as it could be edited from a different method, while only the service should be able to edit those. So let's go ahead and let's write the method for the get user. So the get user is going to be applied with a user ID. So if you do a get to users followed by a slash and then the user ID, this method is automatically going to be hit. So let's write this method and let's write the get user method, which is receiving a user ID of type string. Let's just call it string for simplicity. And in here we're going to return with the user that has that particular method. So you're going to do this.users dot find, so it's going to return the first user that matches a particular predicate, and we pass through the user, and then for each user we're going to return the user that has ID equal to ID. Now in this case we're assuming that there are no not found, so always the user is going to return something. However, if that should not be the case, we're going to return undefined, which we should handle. But for simplicity, I'm not going to do this right now. I'm going to do it a little later. In here, we're going to have a parameter, so we can use the param decorator coming from NestJS and use it. Now, here we're going to specify the name of the param, which is going to be user ID. And here we specify user ID, which is of type string. And we're going to pass it to the get user method. So let's go ahead and let's write the next method. We're gonna have the put method, which is gonna targeting one particular user for update. So we're gonna have another parameter, which is user ID. And the method I'm gonna call it just update user. Exactly like before, I'm going to have a param decorator user ID of which I'm going to name user ID of type string, and then I'm going to grab extra information from the body exactly like we did earlier. So we're going to have a body, and then we're going to specify the other variables exactly as we did above. So we're going to have name of type string, then we're going to have an age, we're going to have a surname, and finally an email. Okay, VS Code is complaining, but it's actually because we are not using this as a function, so let's change that. And now we're going to return this user service dot update user, and this function is going to take all of these parameters: user ID, name, age, surname, and email. And then we can go ahead and write this method in the backend, in the service. So let's simply take this function, let's paste all of this, and let's add a type for all of these methods, which are all of type string except for age, which is of type number. Now we are using this getUser, which I'm going to need for return in the method above. So what we can do now is to move this method into a shared private method in this class to proceed. We're going to return the ID and the index inside the array of users and the user itself, so that we can easily update this user. So let's write the function that is private that gets our user by ID. So we're going to call it getUser by ID, and as a parameter gets an ID of type string, and we want to return the user itself and the index in the array, because this way we can actually do other operations to delete and update in other methods with this. So we're going to use the findIndex method, which is in the array of JavaScript, and then we can actually return the user at this ID, so this.users at this ID, and the index as well. And now we can actually go on and use it in our getUser method, update user and delete user, which we are going to write shortly. Now, as you can see, this getUser by ID, it can actually be already substituted in this method here in the getUser. So we're going to use getUser by ID, this dot getUser by ID, and then we provide it the ID, and now we need to return the first element, which is of type user. Now, in this method, we should also handle things like 404, such as you try to find a user that is not actually there. I'm not doing it at this stage, however, NestJS offers an API for this. So let's simply return this one, which is matching the first element of this index user, and then let's use it in the update method. So in this case, we actually want to return both. We want to return the user itself as well as the index. So we have the target user and the index, and we can use object destructuring for it. So now that we have our target user and the index, let's build up an object which has all of those properties. As you can see, I made a new user object, which is object spreading so that all the properties gets from the old object to the new object, they get kept. And let's create a new user, which is going to be in our method. However, as you can see, TypeScript is complaining because this user's index can also return simply a number. So we need to specify, you need to tell TypeScript this function is simply going to return always a user and a number. However, if we do an exception of 404, we would also want to return a never object. Let's rename this to new user params, because those are parameters which are going to pass through our new user class. So we're going to provide target user, the ID that is being passed through originally, and then user params dot name, age, surname, and email. Let's rename this to NUP for new user param. And let's pass all of this through. And that's everything. Okay, there is no extra method in here that we need to pass through. And now simply we're going to substitute the element at a certain index position to the new index position, we're simply returning this new user that we just created. It should be actually updated user, but alright, doesn't matter, I might change it later. Let's move on to the next method, which is gonna be an HTTP delete. As before, you might already guessed it, we have a user ID, which is through a decorator, and we have our method, which doesn't really matter what you call it. I'm gonna call it delete user, which gets the parameter user ID, which is of course of named user ID and of type string. And this is gonna simply call our service for the delete user method that now we're going to simply write. So let's provide the user ID. Let's go back to our service and create this method. Delete user, which takes an ID of type string, and then finds that ID. So we're gonna do const exactly like we did earlier, target and index of the user, and then this get users by ID. And now we take the users and then we splice. So we can give the first element of the splice gonna be the start position, which is our index, and then how many positions we want to delete, so just one. Now this is returning an error because I made a mistake. Instead of calling it this.getUser by ID, I'm actually calling it this.getUser. So it's actually trying to call a function that tries to find a user from our service. So it's complaining. And I called the first variable an underscore because I'm not actually using it. So to indicate it, I'm using an underscore. Or if I wanted to, could simply take the first element of that array, so the element position 1. Let's have a look at everything if everything works. So I'm already put a few elements in it to test it in the meantime. Let's try to add a new element. So we have random element, 22 years of age, a surname, and an email. And there you go, we get all of our items back. Let's try to get one element, which is the last one we had used. And there you go, we return it correctly. Let's try to do a put so that we can actually check if editing an element actually works and retains the values that we are not touching. Yep, it looks like it's working. Let's do a get of that same element and of all of the elements. Delete, get, and there you go. All the elements are here.